The farmhouse leaned into the dusk as if it were as tired as the man inside. The wind had been tugging at its loose boards all afternoon, and now that the sun had slipped low, the rattling grew sharper, like fingers dragging over bone. The place smelled of old wood smoke and dust. A single candle burned on the rough-hewn table, its flame too small for the size of the room, but enough to cast long, trembling shadows against the walls. John Marlowe sat hunched over that table, shoulders bent like a man carrying years of defeat. His pen scratched slow across paper already smudged by the heel of his hand, each word etched heavy with a kind of finality that only comes when a man has run out of rope. The letter was not long. He had tried to write something noble, something that might soften the blow, but the words refused him. Instead, the page carried fragments: his apology for debts unpaid, his failure to keep the farm alive, his longing for the wife he had buried 7 winters ago. He wrote of the silence in the house, how it gnawed at him worse than hunger. He wrote of the land that had turned against him, of the corn that withered before tassel, of the cattle sold for pennies, of neighbors who had once shared laughter but now shared only pitying glances. The letter was not meant for anyone in particular. Maybe it was for the bankman who had come to claim the farm. Maybe it was for the preacher who had tried, in vain, to keep John tethered to hope. Or maybe it was only for himself, a record scratched down before he disappeared into the dark. He paused, the nib of his pen suspended over the page, and looked at the words through eyes rimmed red from sleepless nights. His hand trembled slightly. He thought of the rifle propped against the wall, cleaned and oiled, though unused for months. He thought of the barn loft, the rope coiled neat as a snake. The candle sputtered, and in that moment, he felt the whole house lean closer, listening to whether he would make his choice tonight. Outside, the land was still except for the wind that had picked up grit and carried it against the window panes in tiny rattling bursts. The sound was hollow, like an empty warning. He folded the paper once, then again, pressing it down with both hands as though sealing away the last of his strength. He leaned back, exhaling hard through his nose, staring at the folded letter that now seemed to glow in the candlelight, like some final verdict. And then it happened. A sound, faint but sharp enough to cut through the silence, drifted in from the porch. A voice, a woman's, low and steady, carrying words that did not belong to any neighbor he knew. It wasn't a cry or a call, but something deliberate, as if spoken only for him. "Are you the one?" The words froze him in place. His breath caught halfway between lungs and lips, his hand still pressed flat on the folded letter. For a long moment he thought he had imagined it born from fatigue and the fevered mind of a man teetering on the edge. But then the boards of the porch creaked, slow and certain, followed by the whisper of cloth shifting in the wind. John turned his head toward the door, every muscle taut. The farmhouse had been a place of solitude for years, visited only by the occasional rider bringing news or debt notices. No one came after sundown. No one should have been there now. He reached instinctively for the rifle against the wall, his fingers brushing the wood before he stopped. The question lingered in the air, heavy and strange, as if the night itself had asked it. "Are you the one?" The words echoed again in his mind, unsettling in their simplicity. The letter sat forgotten on the table, the candle flame bending toward the draft that seeped under the door, as though drawn to whatever presence now waited outside. John Marlowe's life had been moving toward its end only moments ago, but with that voice, the line of it bent suddenly, sharply, toward something he did not yet understand. The knock never came. Instead, the door eased open on its own, the wind nudging it inward just far enough to reveal the shape standing in its frame. John's hand hovered near the rifle, but the figure did not cross the threshold. She stood there as if bound by some unspoken rule, framed by the fading light of dusk and the thin curtain of rain that had begun to fall. A cloak clung to her shoulders, heavy and dark, its edges dripping onto the porch boards, and beneath the hood he saw only the pale outline of a face marked by exhaustion, yet sharpened by purpose. Her voice, when it came again, was steady, though softened by the wear of miles. "Are you the one?" she asked, the same words that had stolen him from despair only moments before. Now, spoken so near, they carried weight like a key sliding into a lock long forgotten. John straightened slowly, his body stiff with suspicion. "The one what?" His voice rasped from disuse, low and guarded. The woman pushed back her hood, revealing features cut from hard living. Dark hair clung wet against her temples. Her eyes gray as slate held him in a way that unsettled him, not because they threatened, but because they seemed to see too much. She let the silence linger before answering. "The one who carries a name that was promised." He stared at her, uncomprehending. "You've come to the wrong place," he muttered, half rising to shut the door. "There's nothing promised here. Just a broken farm, and a man with nothing left to give." She didn't flinch at the dismissal. Instead, she stepped one pace closer, her boots thudding on the porch wood. Still, she did not cross into his home. "I've been searching a long time," she said. "Years. Through towns that barely remember their own names. Through men who lied and men who ran. Each trail led me further west, until it ended here, at your door." Her certainty scraped against him like a plow blade against stone. He shook his head. "I don't know who you think I am. My name's John Marlowe, just a farmer. My promises died with my wife." At that, her expression flickered. A brief sadness crossed her face, so fleeting he almost doubted he'd seen it. She lowered her gaze to the floorboards, then raised it again, the steel back in her eyes. "Marlowe," she repeated, almost like a prayer. "Then you are the one." John's hand pressed harder against the door. He wanted her gone, wanted the quiet back, even if that quiet had been leading him to his end. Strangers carried trouble, always had. Yet something in her voice made his chest tighten, a note he could not dismiss. It was not demand, nor threat. It was recognition, as if she had been walking toward this moment her entire life, and would not be moved from it. The rain tapped harder on the roof, filling the silence between them. John swallowed, unsure of whether to push her back into the storm or to ask her inside. His instincts screamed caution, but beneath the weight of suspicion stirred something he had not felt in years, a pull of curiosity, faint, yet undeniable. He studied her again, this Alara, and saw in the slump of her shoulders and the dirt caked on her boots that she was no simple wanderer looking for charity. She had come with a purpose. And though his better judgment urged him to send her away, he found his hand loosening on the door, leaving just enough space for the candlelight to spill across her tired face. "Say your piece," he told her finally. "But don't stay long." Her eyes softened then, just slightly, as though she knew she had already won more than she expected. She stepped forward, not yet into his house, but into his life, and with her came the storm that would tear apart everything he thought he knew. The storm pressed heavier as the night settled, wind rolling across the land in long sighs that rattled the loose boards of the barn and hissed through the cracks of the farmhouse. John stood by the door, his frame stiff as if bracing against more than weather. Ilara lingered on the porch, her cloak dripping onto the warped planks, her gray eyes never leaving his. He meant to shut the door and be done with her, but hesitation kept his hand from moving. Something about her presence clung like burrs to the back of his mind. Her gaze shifted past him, drawn across the yard where the barn hunched against the slope of the hill. The old structure was near as weathered as the man who worked it would, bleached by sun, patched with whatever scraps John could find, doors sagging from rusted hinges. But Alara's attention fixed on the left panel, the place where the boards were stained darker than the rest. Even from the porch, even through the wash of rain, she seemed to recognize something there. Her breath caught, and before John could stop her, she stepped down into the mud and moved toward it. "Where are you going?" he called after her, irritation threading his voice. She didn't answer until she reached the barn door. Her hand, thin and pale against the wet wood, traced over the faded scar in the planks. The mark had been there as long as John could remember, burned into the wood deep enough that weather couldn't wash it away. It was no more than a cattle brand, shaped like a crooked circle crossed by a line. His father had pressed it into his herd decades ago, a symbol of ownership like any other. John never thought of it twice, but Alara stared at it with a reverence that unsettled him. "This is it," she whispered, her voice tight with certainty. "The mark of the covenant." John stepped off the porch, his boots sinking into the mud, and approached her with a scowl. "It's a cattle brand," he said flatly. "Every rancher out here's got one. That one was my father's. Just old wood and older history, nothing more." But Alara shook her head, rain dripping from her dark hair as she looked at him. "No, this isn't a brand, it's a seal. I've seen it scratched on old ledgers in border towns. Carved into stone above wells that never ran dry. Painted on doors of families who vanished overnight. Always the same crooked circle, always the line through its heart. It's not the mark of a herd. It's the mark of a promise." John barked a laugh, though it came out hollow. "A promise? My father was no man of promises. He could barely keep his word to his own family, let alone to anyone else." Her fingers lingered on the burned groove in the wood. "Not your father, his father, and maybe further back still. This mark is tied to an oath that predates you. It's the reason I've come." John felt a twinge in his chest, as if the air had shifted. He looked at the mark, truly looked, and though he had stared at it since boyhood, tonight it seemed to burn with new life under her words. Yet habit and bitterness hardened him again. "You're chasing ghosts," he muttered. "My family's name doesn't carry weight. It barely carries past the county line." Ilara's eyes caught his, unwavering. "That's because it was buried. Hidden under years of silence, bought and paid for by those who wanted it forgotten. But marks like these don't fade. They call back what was sworn, no matter how many winters pass." Lightning cracked across the sky, and for a heartbeat the barn glowed in white fire. The brand stood out stark against the dark wood, sharper than John had ever seen it. He swallowed hard, unsure if it was the storm or the woman's conviction that made the symbol feel suddenly alive. Ilara lowered her hand and stepped back, her cloak clinging to her frame. "You can send me away if you like," she said, her voice softer now, though no less certain. "But know this: men have died searching for this mark, and now I've found it. That means they'll find it too. Whatever you believe, you are no longer alone in this." John stared at her, the rain seeping cold through his shirt. He wanted to call her mad, to turn his back and bolt the farmhouse door. Yet the way she spoke, the fire in her eyes, as she looked at that old brand, had unsettled something deep inside him. He turned toward the barn once more, the faint black circle etched against the wood, and for the first time in years, he wondered if his father had carried secrets he never intended his son to know. The farmhouse smelled of damp wood and old smoke, the kind of scent that clung to the bones of a place long after warmth had left it. John opened the door just wide enough for Alara to step through, his hand still heavy on the latch as if he might change his mind. She crossed the threshold with the caution of someone entering sacred ground, her boots leaving a trail of rainwater on the worn floorboards. John shut the door behind her, the wind outside immediately swallowed by the muffled hush of the room. The single lamp on the table cast a circle of amber light that barely reached the corners. John set another log on the fire, watching sparks snap upward before settling into a steady glow. Ilara unfastened her cloak, draping it over the back of a chair, her movements deliberate and quiet. She stood for a moment, eyes roaming the room as if searching for something hidden in plain sight, the shelves stacked with chipped crockery, the narrow cot against the wall. The letter John had left folded beside the lamp. He moved quickly to pocket that, his face unreadable. "Sit," he muttered, gesturing to the chair opposite the table. She obeyed, folding her hands before her, and waited as he ladled out what little stew remained from the pot over the fire. It was thin, more broth than meat, but it carried warmth, and she accepted the bowl without complaint. John ate with the silence of habit, but Alara only lifted her spoon once before setting it down again. her eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made the air feel heavier. "You don't believe me," she said softly. John snorted, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "You ride in out of the storm, ask strange questions, point at an old cattle brand like it's scripture. And now you're telling me my family was tied up in something bigger? You'll forgive me if I don't jump to believe." Ilara leaned forward, her shadow stretching across the table. "It wasn't cattle, John. It was land. Land that men killed for, that whole families disappeared over. The mark on your barn was carved into more than wood, it was carved into records, maps, deeds that were never meant to be seen by the wrong eyes. A circle divided by a line. It was the seal of a pact made by landholders who swore to keep truth hidden until the right heir could reveal it." He shook his head, a bitter smile tugging at his mouth. "Sounds like something a storyteller dreams up by the fire. My father left me nothing but debt. If he was part of a grand society, he hid it well." "He had to," Alara pressed, "because others were hunting it. Heirs vanished, claims were buried beneath false signatures. Families who carried the seal scattered or died under mysterious circumstances. Every trail I followed led back to silence until now. Your name, Marlowe, was the last I found, the last that still lived." Her words settled into him despite his resistance, like seeds forced into dry ground. He wanted to dismiss them, to laugh and call her a fool, but something in her voice held no tremor of invention. She spoke with the cadence of someone who had walked too far, seen too much, and carried truths that had grown heavy with time. John leaned back, arms crossed, but his eyes betrayed the unease stirring in him. "Even if any of that were true, why come to me? I'm no heir. I'm a man with a failing farm, and nothing worth stealing." Alara's gaze did not waver. "Because it isn't about what you have now. It's about what was taken before you ever knew it was yours. You are the last surviving link, John. The seal wasn't burned into your barn by chance." The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. John stared into the flames, his jaw tight. He wanted to tell her to leave, to take her stories with her. Yet the conviction in her eyes gnawed at the edges of his certainty, leaving him with the uneasy sense that his life own he had been ready to surrender only hours ago was no longer entirely his own. The rain eased into a steady drizzle that drummed lightly on the roof, softening the edges of the storm. Inside, the farmhouse had grown warmer, the fire throwing a tired glow across the room. Ilara sat near the hearth, her back to the stonework, the lines of fatigue finally pulling her eyes closed. Her breathing evened into the rhythm of someone who had gone too far and carried too much. John watched her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before retreating to the table where the folded paper still lay heavy in his pocket. He drew it out and smoothed it flat beneath the lamplight, his rough hand covering most of the words he already knew by heart. He had written them with the intention of leaving nothing behind but ashes and silence. Words to explain what could never truly be explained. The page bore the marks of despair more than ink letters crooked from shaking fingers, lines broken off where the weight of thought had been too much. He had meant it to be the last thing of him. Now, staring down at it again, he felt a strange unease, as if the letter belonged to another man altogether. The words mocked him in their finality. He read the part where he called himself a failure, where he spoke of the land as dead and himself as buried with it. Yet there was Alara asleep by his fire, speaking of promises and conspiracies that tied his name to something larger than this farm. She had unsettled the quiet grave he had dug for himself, forcing air back into lungs that had already surrendered their breath. John lifted the page, holding it between his fingers as though testing its weight. It was lighter than it had felt hours ago, no more than paper, fragile and thin. He turned his eyes to the fire, the flames leaning toward him, their heat brushing his knuckles. For a long while he sat that way, caught between the comfort of ending and the unease of beginning again. At last he fed the letter into the flames. The paper curled instantly, black creeping across its surface like a shadow racing ahead of dawn. Words dissolved into smoke, sentences that had once carried his surrender crumbling into nothing. He leaned back, watching it vanish, and the silence that followed was heavier than before. The act did not free him. It bound him tighter to the unknown path now opening in front of him. The fire hissed as the last scrap collapsed into ash. John rubbed his hands together, as if to wipe away the memory of what he had written, but the weight remained in his chest, stubborn as stone. He glanced at Alara. Her face softened in sleep, her features younger without the burden of constant vigilance. She looked like someone who had carried too many miles, too many secrets, yet still found the strength to speak of hope. He envied her conviction. He feared it too. She had walked into his house on the very night he had chosen to leave life behind, and with a few words had altered the course of his despair. That thought pressed against him like a hand at his back, urging him forward though he did not know the road. He could not decide whether to curse her for it or thank her. Outside, the rain thinned into mist, leaving the air heavy with the scent of wet earth. John stood, pacing once before settling against the edge of the hearth. The warmth reached his bones, but it could not quiet the restlessness growing inside him. The letter was gone, its ashes scattered among the embers, yet the reasons he had written it still pressed against him. Loss, loneliness, debt, the ache of a life cut hollow. None of that had vanished with the flames. But now, there was something else layered atop it all. A mark on the barn that meant more than he had believed. A stranger who spoke his name like it carried weight. A story that stretched beyond his field lines into a history he had never been told. John lowered himself into the chair, elbows on his knees, staring into the fire as though it might shape answers from its shifting flames. The farmhouse creaked, the storm whispered against the windows, and Alara shifted slightly in her sleep, murmuring words he could not catch. He sat until the candle burned low, the ashes of his goodbye letter cooling into dust, while the heaviness in his chest refused to lift. It was no longer the weight of despair alone. It was the burden of something larger, something unfinished, waiting in the dark to be named. The first hint of morning was nothing more than a pale seam along the horizon, a gray light pressing against the blackness of night. John had not slept. He sat near the cold edges of the hearth, staring into the fire's faint embers while the weight of questions gnawed at him. Alara had stirred once or twice but said nothing, drifting in and out of uneasy rest. The quiet outside was heavy, thick enough to make even the smallest sound ring sharp. That was why, when the first echo of hooves rolled across the ridge, John heard it clear as a bell. He stiffened, head turning toward the window. At first it came like distant thunder, growing from a murmur into a steady rhythm, the sound of horses moving fast. He rose to his feet as dust lifted in the half-light silhouettes cutting across the ridgeline above his land. Not one rider, but several, their shapes moving in formation like wolves, circling prey. His breath caught in his throat, and for a moment he thought it was some nightmare conjured from the strange talk of the night before. But then Alara's eyes opened, sharp and awake as if she had been expecting it. "They found us," she whispered, already on her feet. Her cloak slid from the chair as she reached for the satchel she carried. "Claim jumpers, they won't stop at words. They've come to erase every trace of what you are." John's jaw tightened, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. "This is my land," he said, though the words sounded weak against the steady drum of hooves. "No one has any claim to it but me." "That's what makes you dangerous," Alara replied, eyes flicking to the rifle propped against the wall. "Your name, your family's market threatens everything they've stolen. If they take you down now, the truth dies with you." The thought struck him harder than the fear itself. He hadn't raised that rifle in years, not since the day his wife had been buried, and he swore never to point it again, never to feel the weight of violence in his hands. The dust outside thickened as the riders descended, their shadows breaking apart to surround the farmhouse. The creak of saddles and the metallic jingle of spurs cut through the early stillness. One rider called out, his voice deep and mocking. Marlowe, step out. Time to settle what should have been buried long ago. Alara's eyes burned in the dim light. If you walk out there unarmed, you're already dead. John's heart hammered, the old ache of grief rising with the thought of holding that rifle again. He remembered his wife's face, her gentle plea for him to leave the fighting to others, to tend only to the land and the family they dreamed of raising. But that dream had withered, and now the land itself seemed to call for blood. His hand shook as he reached for the weapon, fingers brushing the wood. The weight of it dragged memories up from the grave, but so did the urgency in Alara's voice. The riders circled, their hooves pounding the earth into a drumbeat of menace. John slid the bolt of the rifle, the sound loud in the silence. He felt the kick of his pulse, the strange mix of fear and clarity that comes when a man knows the fight has finally found him. Alara moved to the window, crouched low, her eyes never leaving the shadows outside. "They won't wait long," she murmured. "They think you're alone. They don't know you've been found." The first shot cracked against the barn, splinters flying as wood shattered. John flinched but kept his grip steady, his body remembering the old rhythm even as his spirit balked. Alara's hand pressed briefly against his arm, steadying him. "You've been ready for this longer than you realize," she said. Another voice shouted from outside, colder, closer. "Last chance, Marlowe. Hand it over, or we burn you out." John drew in a long breath, the taste of smoke and fear on his tongue. He looked at Alara, whose gray eyes held not fear but conviction, and something inside him shifted. For years he had been waiting to disappear, waiting for silence to claim him. Now men had come to take his land, his name, his very history, and the thought of surrender filled him with a fire he had thought gone forever. He raised the rifle to his shoulder, the familiar weight settling into place, and the man who had once written a goodbye letter felt himself erased. In his place stood someone new, or perhaps someone very old, who would not give ground without a fight. The thunder of hooves grew nearer, the circle of riders closing tight. John's voice was low but steady, as he whispered to Alara, "Then, let them come." The silence between the shouts and the shots broke like glass. A rider spurred his horse too close to the porch, rifle raised, and John fired before he had time to think. The crack of his own weapon startled him, a sound that shook the dust from the rafters and sent the horse rearing. The man toppled into the mud with a cry, rolling before scrambling back toward cover. That was all it took. Gunfire erupted around the farmhouse, bullets slamming into wood, shattering windows, and filling the air with a storm of smoke and splinters. John ducked behind the table, his breath coming in hard bursts. The rifle felt heavy, alive in his hands, and yet his aim found its place as though the years of disuse had been only hours. Each shot he fired was met with a shout or a ricochet, the air alive with the raw fury of men trying to erase him. Ilara moved with the certainty of someone who had fought before. She slid across the floor, pulling a pistol from beneath her cloak, firing sharp and steady into the shadows outside. One rider went down with a scream, clutching his chest, his horse bolting riderless into the dark. In the chaos, John's eyes caught on something strange. One of the men crouched behind the barn door carried a leather satchel slung across his back. Even in the chaos of smoke and blood, John recognized the symbol burned into its flap, the same crooked circle with a line cutting through it, the mark on his father's barn. His breath caught. He nearly lost his grip on the rifle as the weight of that image bore down on him. "Ilara," he shouted over the din, pointing through the broken window. "The bag." She turned just as the rider dashed across the yard, the satchel swinging against his side. Alara vaulted through the broken doorway without hesitation, her cloak flaring behind her. John fired twice, forcing the rider off balance, buying her the few precious steps she needed. She collided with the man in the mud, her knife flashing in the half-light. There was a struggle grunts, the scuffle of boots, the horse neighing in panic. Then her blade struck true. The rider collapsed, the satchel slipping free from his shoulders as the life bled out of him. John's gut twisted at the sight, but Alara was already on her knees, pulling the leather bag close. She sprinted back to the farmhouse, sliding across the floor as bullets whined through the night air. She dropped the satchel between them, her breath ragged. "It's theirs," she said, eyes alight with something more than battle fire. "But it was yours first." John tore the flap open with shaking hands, the smell of leather and dust rushing out. Inside were rolled maps, creased and yellowed but intact, and bundles of papers sealed with old wax. His eyes caught on signatures, land descriptions, deeds inked in careful handwriting. He recognized the name at the bottom of several pages, Thomas Marlowe, his father. His heart slammed against his ribs. "These aren't just claims," Alara said, rifling through the bundle with practiced speed. "They're proof. Deeds naming your family as rightful owners of land stretching from here to the river valley. Land stolen decades ago and buried beneath forged papers." John's throat went dry. He had spent his life believing his father had left him nothing but debt, that the farm was all that tied him to the earth. And now, in the middle of blood and fire, he held evidence that his family's name had once meant something, that men had died to bury it. Outside, the riders regrouped, their voices rising in anger. The fight was far from finished, but John no longer felt like a man cornered. He felt the papers heavy in his hands, as though they carried not just his father's signature, but his father's voice. For the first time in years, the weight pressing on his chest was not despair, was purpose. Alara reloaded quickly, her eyes hard. "They'll kill us for these. That's why we can't let them go." John nodded, his grip tightening on the rifle. The gunfire started again, bullets tearing into the walls. But his fear had shifted, reshaped by the truth he now held. The blood in the dirt, the smoke choking the air, the men outside, all of it suddenly seemed part of a larger story, one that began long before he was born. The satchel lay open between them, its maps and documents spilling across the table, proof that his family's name had been stolen. Proof worth dying for. John rose from his cover, rifle in hand, voice low and steady. "Then we make sure they don't take it back." The farmhouse had fallen into a strained quiet, broken only by the hiss of rain against the eaves and the soft crackle of the fire trying to hold its own against the damp air. Smoke still lingered inside, curling up from shattered wood and drifting like ghosts through the lamplight. John sat at the table with the leather satchel open before him, the maps and deeds spread across the scarred wood. His hands hovered above them, not touching, as though he feared the papers might vanish if he pressed too hard. The echo of gunfire still throbbed in his ears, each memory of it cutting deeper than the bullet scars pitted in the walls. Ilara leaned against the hearth, her cloak drawn close, face pale beneath the dirt and blood of the night. She had fought without hesitation, her blade finding its mark, her pistol never wavering. But now her shoulders sagged with exhaustion, her eyes flickering between John and the papers as though weighing what to say next. John finally spoke, his voice low and raw. "Why me?" His hand slammed down suddenly on the table, rattling the lamp. "Why come to me now, after all these years? You walk through my door with riddles, bring death to my land, and tell me my father's name was worth killing for. I want the truth, Alara. All of it." She met his gaze, and for the first time since arriving, her eyes softened, not with pity, but with something heavier, older. She stepped closer, the firelight catching on the damp strands of her hair. "Because it was promised," she said quietly. "Not by me, by my father." John frowned, confusion shadowing his face. She drew in a breath, steadying herself, then lowered onto the chair opposite him. Her hands, still trembling faintly, rested on the edge of the table. "My father was no rich man, no landholder. He was a messenger. A man entrusted with carrying secrets others would not risk keeping themselves. 20 years ago, he swore an oath to Thomas Marlowe, keep the truth alive until it could be returned to his blood. He spent the rest of his life honoring that oath, chasing scraps of evidence, hiding what little he could save from men who wanted it buried. Before he died, he passed it to me. Find the son of Marlowe, he told me. Deliver the truth. Her words struck him harder than gunfire. John leaned back, the weight of his name heavy in his ears. And you think that's me? Just because of a brand on a barn? I wasn't sure at first, she admitted. When I came across your name, there was doubt. Too many families had been wiped out. Too many heirs lost to time or murder. I couldn't be certain you were the one my father spoke of, not until I saw the mark burned into your barn. That symbol was their seal, the proof of the covenant your bloodline carried. When I saw it, I knew. You were the son of Marlowe, the last one left. John stared at the deeds, his pulse hammering. His life had been nothing but toil, failure, and the slow suffocation of loneliness. He had written a goodbye letter with no expectation anyone would ever care enough to read it. Now a stranger was telling him he carried the weight of generations, that his very blood tied him to land men had killed for. His voice cracked as he spoke. My father never told me, not a word of this. He left me with nothing but a broken farm. Why would he keep it from me? Ilara's expression was sorrowful. Because to tell you would have marked you for death. You were safer in ignorance. The consortium knew heirs remained, but they could never find the proof. He gave his life to keep it from them, just as my father gave his to bring it back to you. Both believed the truth would outlive them. John rubbed his face with rough hands, a bitter laugh escaping him. And now it's my burden. The farm, the debt, the guns at my door, and this. He gestured at the maps, his voice rising. All because of a promise made before I was born. Ilara's hand touched his arm, firm but gentle. Not a burden, John, a legacy. You have been carrying it all along without knowing. Now you can choose what to do with it. Her words lingered in the air, as sharp and heavy as the rifle leaning in the corner. John met her eyes and saw no deception there, only conviction tempered by loss. The kind of conviction that came from living under a vow not her own, bound to a duty she never asked for. The fire cracked, a log collapsing into embers, and the silence that followed was thick. John's chest ached with the weight of it all, his father's ghost, Ilara's confession. The satchel filled with truths men had died to close father's ghost. The morning broke without calm. From the ridge, the thunder of hooves rose again, louder, heavier, no longer the probing circle of a handful of men, but the charge of a small army. Dust trailed behind them, a dark ribbon cutting through the pale dawn. John stood at the broken window, rifle in hand, his shoulders tight but his eyes steady. The satchel lay sealed on the table behind him, the maps and deeds tucked away again, their weight pressing on him like the hand of his father. Ilara moved quickly through the farmhouse, her voice sharp but controlled, pulling shutters closed, dragging heavy furniture against the doors, laying out what little ammunition remained. They've brought more this time, she said, glancing toward the sound of riders. They mean to end this before the day is out. John nodded once. His breath fogged the cracked glass as he stared into the rising dust. Then we make them bleed for it. There had been a time, not long ago, when he had been ready to surrender to silence, to let the world carry on without him. But now the ground beneath him was different. The land he had cursed as barren and faithless was suddenly alive with meaning, not just soil but the marrow of his father's name. He could feel it in his chest, in the set of his jaw, in the way his hands no longer trembled on the rifle. The first shots came quick, shattering the stillness. Bullets struck the outer walls, spitting splinters across the room. John dropped to one knee, sighting down the barrel, and fired into the dust cloud where a rider broke too close. The man fell, his horse veering into the chaos. Ilara returned fire from the other window, her pistol steady, her cloak tied tight around her shoulders. The farmhouse groaned under the barrage, walls rattling as lead tore through wood. They had no time to think, only to move. John slammed a door shut as it buckled under a boot from outside, bracing it with his shoulder while Ilara drove a knife through the crack, drawing a muffled scream. Smoke filled the air as one of the claim jumpers hurled a torch through the shattered window. Flames caught on the ragged curtain, and John beat it down with his coat, the stench of scorched fabric choking them both. "Fire's their weapon now," Alara warned, reloading with quick hands. "If they burn us out, the documents burn too." John's eyes darkened. "Then we hold until there's nothing left to hold with." The battle stretched into a brutal rhythm. Every window cracked, every wall scored with holes, every inch of ground contested. John fired until his shoulder throbbed, until his ears rang, and the taste of powder coated his tongue. Men fell outside, their cries mingling with the chaos of horses and the roar of flames licking the edges of the farmhouse. Yet more kept coming, driven by the promise of silencing the truth forever. At one point, the front door splintered inward, and 3 riders surged through the breach. John met them head-on, swinging the butt of his rifle like a hammer, bone cracking beneath the blow. Ilara moved like a shadow at his side, her blade flashing, her gun barking sharp and final. The room became a furnace of violence, the floor slick with mud and blood dragged in from the storm outside. Through it all, John felt a strange calm, as if every pull of the trigger was not only defense, but reclamation. He was no longer the man who had written a goodbye letter by lamplight. He was Thomas Marlowe's son, the heir to land worth dying for, fighting not for the life he had lost, but for the legacy stolen from him. Smoke thickened, choking the air, the fire spreading from curtain to beam. Outside, the reinforcements wavered, their numbers broken against the stubborn defense of 2 people who refused to yield. The farmhouse stood scarred and burning, but it still stood. John reloaded one last time, eyes burning from heat and ash, and looked to Alara. "If we fall here," he said, his voice hoarse but unwavering, "they'll know it cost them everything to take it." Ilara's gray eyes met his, fierce and unflinching. "Then let's make them pay every drop." The battle raged on, brutal and unrelenting, a storm of fire and blood. And in its heart stood John Marlowe, no longer resigned to death, but alive with the desperate resolve of a man fighting for the truth his father had left behind. The first light of dawn spilled over the ridge, pale and hesitant, as though even the sun doubted whether this farm had survived the night. Smoke drifted from the farmhouse roof where flames had licked the shingles, leaving black scars against the wood. The windows were shattered, the doors broken and splintered, the yard churned into a battlefield of hoofprints and blood, but the house still stood, the barn still stood. And John Marlowe still stood, rifle in hand, breath steaming in the morning chill. The last of the claim jumpers had broken in the final hour before sunrise. Some lay still in the mud, their weapons dropped from lifeless hands, while others had fled into the hills, their retreat swallowed by the distance. John's chest heaved with exhaustion, his shirt torn and streaked with soot, but his eyes were steady. For the first time in years, he felt the ground beneath his boots not as a burden but as something worth fighting for. Ilara emerged from the doorway, her cloak singed at the edges, her face streaked with grime. She carried herself with the weariness of someone who had spent the night shoulder to shoulder with death, yet her steps were firm, her gaze unyielding. In her hand, she carried the leather satchel, its flap dark with rain but intact. She set it on the table outside the house, her fingers brushing over the burned seal. "It held," she murmured. "Through fire, through blood it held." Before John could answer, the sound of hooves carried once more through the valley. He turned sharply, rifle raised, but these riders were different. Their formation was precise, their horses clean, their voices calm. The glint of badges caught the dawn as the lawmen rode down from the ridge, summoned by the signal Ilara had sent before the worst of the night had fallen. Their leader, a broad-shouldered marshal with lines etched deep into his weathered face, reined in his horse and surveyed the ruin with a slow, grim nod. "We had word trouble was stirring out here," he said, his eyes flicking to the bodies in the yard, then to John, then to Ilara. "Seems the word was true." Ilara stepped forward, placing the satchel in the marshal's hands. These are the documents they came to bury. Proof of forged claims. Proof of theft. Her voice was steady, though her shoulders trembled with exhaustion. They belonged to him now, to Marlowe. The marshal unfastened the flap and glanced at the papers within, his brow furrowing as he traced the inked signatures and maps. He looked at John with something between respect and pity. This will see daylight in the courts. If what's here is true, men have lived rich on stolen land for decades. That ends now. John lowered his rifle, the weight of it sliding from his arms as though his body finally understood it could rest. His gaze shifted to Alara. She was watching him, not the lawman, her gray eyes holding the same fire they had carried when she first appeared on his porch. The night had burned away all pretense. She was no longer just a stranger at his door. She was the reason he had not ended his life with a folded letter and a quiet surrender. He thought of that letter now, its ashes scattered in the hearth. The words he had written no longer belonged to him. In their place was something else, something he did not yet know how to carry but knew he must. As the lawmen gathered the evidence and the wounded silence stretched between them, Alara spoke softly, her voice cutting through the smoke and ruin. "Are you the one?" John turned fully toward her, the question striking him with the same force it had the night before. Only this time he felt no confusion, no hollow ache in his chest. He let out a slow breath, the weight of his father's name heavy but no longer unbearable. His eyes met hers, and he gave a small nod. "You are now," she said, answering for him, her words final yet full of promise. The dawn crept higher, washing the scarred land in gold. The farmhouse bore its wounds, but it still stood, and so did he. This was not an ending, John realized, but the first step into something larger, something written long before his hand ever touched the page of a goodbye letter. The fight was not finished, but for the first time in years, he was ready to live it.